Again, just to reference an interview I watched with Jeffrey Epstein again and Steve Bannon, heard some wild things in his interview. Like, for example, Jeffrey Epstein's explaining how he's in county jail. He's not actually not allowed to make any phone calls, and he's on the phone to the CEO of Bear Stearns and I think Goldman Sachs at the same time.
There's a power hierarchy and there's a power structure. So when you talk about the banking system, really the banking system is right at the top of the power structure. Some people even argue that actually the financial system sits on top of nation states themselves. And that actually when you talk about the entities, the institutions and the people that are manipulating global events, that actually it's these financial institutions.
Why is the outlook poorer? Because all this monetary debt, all this debt which is coming from this money tree, has to be serviced. So who is it being serviced by? It's being serviced by people, and it's been serviced by the taxpayer, and it's been serviced by governments who've been borrowing this money, because it has to end up somewhere. And it's probably explained why HMRC have been extremely harsh and ruthless with people. This constant debate I see on LinkedIn about taxis, HMRC, coming after every type of activity. This now makes sense because you have to collect all this money to pay off the debt. Most parents assume their children will live a better life than they did. More opportunity, more security, a chance to build a better future. What if today's younger generation are becoming the first in modern history to earn less, to own less, and struggle more than their parents? Welcome to Foresight Dialogues. Today we discuss why your children will be poorer than you. Shad, one of my friends, a director at a NHS trust, told me that they have to hand out free female sanitation products to nurses who simply can't afford them. How much poorer today are we compared to the year 2000?
I would say that we're significantly poorer. The cost of living over the course of the last 25 years has significantly gone up. So you can see that through the price increases in essentials like eggs. Eggs, I think, in 2000 was around about 60 pence. It's now gone up to nearly £4.
Wow.
The price of petrol was 80 pence. It's now doubled to £1.60. The average house, I think, back in 2000 was around about 80 to 90,000 pounds. In the UK, the average house price is around about 300,000. If you live in London, it's even more than that. You're looking at around about £500,000.
Yeah.
So you're seeing across the board that the cost of everything has gone up within a relatively short period of time. 25 years isn't an overly long period of time.
So so I guess we're not imagining that. So
no.
Have wages gone up? I mean, most people will say no, because that's just a human thing. So have wages gone up around about the same rate?
Okay, so the median wage in 2008 was around about £25,000. Today, the median wage is £38,000, right? So it's increased in nominal terms by 50%. But when you factor in inflation, so you adjust the wage for inflation, you find that actually real wages have only actually gone up by around about 5%. I think 5%, yeah, 5 to 10% tops.
Wow.
GDP in that time, so I think in 2008, it was around about 1.4 trillion pounds. Today, it's approaching 3 trillion pounds. So it's more than doubled. But real GDP growth is around about 20%. So if real wages has only increased by 5%, that means the other 15% has been absorbed by capital.
We'll come back to capital in a minute, but what I want to do is really just simplify it and just really probe into this point. Are we imagining this, or is there a real problem? I think most people will say there is a cost of living crisis now, but in numerical terms, it sounds like some things have gone up by 4 or 5 times, basic things, wages have gone up by 5%. So to put that into numbers, if your wages have gone up by 5%, but basic things have gone up by 500%, because that's what 5 times is, you can see the big disconnect there. And I guess the concept may be purchasing power has dropped.
No, of course it has. And people are feeling it because people are now having to make choices that, arguably before they didn't have to. I think in 2000, people had far more financial capacity. So even if prices increased marginally, they were earning enough for them to still be able to cover all of their basic needs. Now people are, having to actively make a choice between heating and eating, as an example. So we know that when winter comes around and the price of energy, heating the home goes up, and obviously food prices are also going up. So people are having to make sacrifices in one aspect of their sort of life in order to meet a particular need. So by virtue of the fact that people now find themselves in that position, then of course people are feeling it more than they historically ever did.
I think for my kids, this is, it probably hits me home harder. If I think back to what I was earning when I graduated, I could comfortably, live and rent a property, and pretty much enjoy a independent life. I mean, for my kids, that's a pipe dream. So I think in that sense, we can see, graduates cannot live on their own; they have to live with their parents. We can see most of their money is going on just survival, and so that's the real change. So if we move on, would you say it's fair to start with the 2008 financial crash? Is that a good place to start on this?
Yes, I think so.
Right. So can you explain why the 2008 subprime financial crash, which started in America, affected Britain and pretty much the entire world? Why are we talking about America when we're sitting in Britain?
Sure. So what was unique about the 2008 financial crisis is it became apparent how interconnected the global economy became, and more so the financial system. So really what happened in the lead up to the 2008 financial crisis was that, US banks were creating mortgages. They were effectively lending money to what you refer to as sort of low income earners, right? This is the subprime category. And these mortgages, they were being packaged up and they were being sold on. So the banks weren't actually holding on to them. They were actually selling them on to other financial institutions outside of the US. So they were selling it to Europe, so selling it to Japanese institutions, Asia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what that meant was that any potential risk in the US housing market would cascade to other parts of the world.
Because they've bought that debt.
Because they bought that debt, exactly.
So I think what you're describing is a collateralization. Could you just break that down for us? What does that mean?
Sure. So it's you have a specific type of debt. So in this instance, we're talking about housing debt, mortgages.
Yeah.
And the way that these debts, it's referred to as tranches. So not all debt is equal.
That's right.
Some debt is less riskier than others.
Yeah.
And so what happened in the run up to 2008, you basically had 3 tranches. You had the safest, the safest debt. Then you had sort of a mid-tier debt.
Yeah.
And you had the most risky debt. And what they would do is they would effectively mix all 3 together.
Yeah.
So it's almost like potlucks. You have a third of them is good debt, a third is kind of mid-tier, and a third is sort of low quality debt. And they packaged that all together, and then they sort of sold them on to other financial institutions across the world. So what effectively happened was that once the 2008 financial crisis was triggered, so once people in the low income earning brackets started to default on their debt because they couldn't afford the mortgage payments, because all of the debts were mixed together, it was difficult to pinpoint which particular tranches were affected. Right? And because of that, the entire sort of that particular market seized up.
Right. So that's why the US financial system affects every other country in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. But what you haven't explained is who's to blame. So I saw an interview with Steve Bannon around 2019, and believe it or not, Jeffrey Epstein was doing the interview.
Really?
A man who's always unusually close to billionaires, bankers, political power, etc. And he argued that the financial crash of 2008 was caused by Bill Clinton.
So at one point, I had 2 phones. It was difficult because they're afraid people are going to hang themselves with the phone cord. So they don't actually come together and they're pretty short. So I was actually going between 2 phones talking to Bear Stearns and JP Morgan at the same time.
Because Bill Clinton pushed for extended home ownership. He put pressure on banks to increase subprime lending, which is basically lending to people that can't pay it, through inclusion policy. So basically, Bill Clinton was trying to include more and more black people. Pretty much, that's what he's trying to say, and that the financial system was deregulated. Is this true?
So there's partial truth in it. It's not the entire truth. So I think in this scenario, Bill Clinton is a convenient scapegoat.
Right.
But in terms of who, as I said, who are the people that were responsible for actually inflating the housing bubble? It was almost certainly the Bush administration. So I think, interestingly, what was the motivation for it? So why did they inflate the housing bubble? So the Bush administration, obviously, I think the defining event of the first term was basically 9/11 and the post 9/11 wars, beginning with Afghanistan and Iraq. Now, obviously, as an administration, they did not budget for those wars. So, from the perspective of a government that has all of a sudden has to find the necessary financing to pay for wars, how do you go about paying for it without actually raising taxes? Given that increasing taxes is not a popular policy. So this is one of the things that George W. Bush's father found out in.
But the problem with what you're saying is it sounds conspiratorial. I mean, a lot of people will find this hard to take. I mean, how do you justify that?
So it's really a practical question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right. So 9/11 occurred. Off the back of it, 2 wars were launched. The Afghanistan war was launched within, I think, a couple of months of the event itself.
Yeah.
Iraq war was launched in, I think, early part of 2003. It's also worth bearing in mind that according to General Wesley Clark, who was a part of the administration, George Bush administration, the original plan was actually to wage 7 wars in 5 years.
That's right.
Right. So we know that warfare is an expensive business. Now, obviously, these things weren't budgeted for. So how would an administration go about financing it? So this is a practical question. So going back to my point about the obvious way is to either you can increase taxes, which is a deeply unpopular policy, and the public would not tolerate that, or the other one is you can borrow, right? So we know that the Bush administration didn't go with the former.
Former being what? Sorry.
The former being, increasing taxes.
Increasing taxes.
Because actually what they did, they reduced taxes.
They reduced taxes, yeah.
And the reason they reduced taxes is because, as I said, they learnt from George H.W. Bush's tenure.
The father.
That it wasn't a good idea. So that effectively George H.W. Bush, he famously went on record as saying, read my lips, taxes aren't going to go up. What did he end up doing? He increased taxes. Why? In order to fund the first Gulf War.
Yeah.
So from that perspective, how does a government fund a war without actually raising taxes? The obvious way is to increase GDP. So if you increase GDP, then the tax receipts will also increase in line with the GDP. So what you find is from 2000, in 2000, the GDP of the US was $10 trillion.
Yeah.
By the time you get to 2008, the GDP reached 14.7, just under $15 trillion. So you're talking about a 50% nominal increase. Yeah. So what was responsible for that? It was the housing bubble that fundamentally caused the GDP to increase. So by increasing the nominal GDP, then the government is able to increase its
but you-
tax revenues.
But you're saying something quite specific, which is that bubbles are created intentionally. That's my contention, and that I think some people will find it hard to believe.
Well, bubbles are a phenomena that have been around for 500 years,
Yeah.
right? So these things have, the most famous instance of a bubble was the tulip bubble in the Netherlands, I think in the 1630s, right?
The first of its type.
The first of its kind. So prior to that, this phenomena hadn't been recorded, right?
Yeah.
And over the course of the last 400 years, bubbles have been a regular occurrence. They occurred routinely in Britain, in the US, and now the world over.
But these are natural. So the Dutch was a natural phenomenon, meaning that it was just overinflation and a expectation of an increase in tulip prices. So people just effectively bought more until there was a oversupply in the market. But nobody's saying that was done intentionally by the Dutch government, unless you are. I don't know if that's
okay. So who determines how credit is allocated? Right. So who actually determines that? Okay, this money is going to be allocated for this particular purpose, and this money is going to be allocated for this particular purpose. So the point being that somebody somewhere in the system is determining that these financial resources is going to go into the housing market, as an example. So using the housing market as an example, for 100 years, the real house prices in the US were remarkably constant. In terms of the fluctuation
minimal.
It occurred within a very narrow band. And then all of a sudden in the early 2000s, house prices shot up by 60%, which completely goes against the historic trend that existed in the prior century. That means somewhere in the system determined that financial resources were going to be allocated specifically for this purpose. And who determines that? It's the banks. Right? They are the ones that control the.
I think what changed
flow.
What changed for me was Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, because in the 90s and probably early 2000s, the banks that were lending had to lend, and they can only lend up to a certain point because that was the regulation, right? So they can only a certain amount of their holdings can be lent in mortgages, basically, right? And I think someone, and you can probably enlighten me who, I don't know if it was Clinton or if it was Bush, or if it was a mixture of both, deregulated all that first of all, and said you can go higher, you can pretty much put all of it down. Then they they basically then instituted Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, who are two agencies who are created specifically to support the banks in effectively real estate, amongst other things. And what they do is they then buy the loans off the banks. And in so doing, when you buy the loan off the bank, then you effectively create space for the banks to lend more. And we covered Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in our Petrodollar podcast. If you go back in that Petrodollar podcast, we said that one of the valves of the petrodollar system is that a certain amount of money goes in treasuries, and a certain amount of money goes into Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Specifically, Saudi Arabia's PIF loans the money back into Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac so that they can fund the housing bubble. The housing market. A bubble is your contagion, not mine. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, are you saying that's part of this, or is that in the? Because I saw it as independent, but I don't know if you're trying to say
it's all part of the same mechanism. So in terms of first contact is really with commercial banks. So when somebody approaches a bank in order to take out a mortgage, right, they'll obviously go to their local bank or a commercial bank. They'll take out the mortgage, and then that mortgage is effectively handed over to somebody else. So these are the institutions that you're talking about. Remember, so how did the 2008 financial crisis emerge? It was because these mortgages were being chopped up, repackaged, sold on, not just to institutions within the US, but globally, right? So effectively what was happening was that countries that had immense dollar reserves, foreign exchange reserves, they were investing in the US financial markets, investing in a whole plethora of different products, the stock market, bonds, and one of the things was basically mortgage-backed securities. This was one of the products that were on offer.
Right.
So it's through this process. I mean, I think in the end, just off the top of my head, I think the initially in the 2000s, the mortgage debt in the US was around about $5 trillion.
Right.
And by the time you get to around about 2008, mortgage debt had doubled to around about 10 trillion.
That's crazy.
And a significant proportion of that had basically been sent abroad to various different financial institutions abroad. So you can see how the risk was, cascaded to different parts of the world. Because in the event of the crisis, even if you experienced around about $2 to $3 trillion worth of losses on those $10 trillion, that's $2 to $3 trillion, $2 to $3 trillion worth of losses that is going to be experienced globally.
Right.
So what you're describing is basically the institutions that were involved and the mechanism by which the debt fundamentally spread around the world.
I think that is part of what we do at the podcast. We try to actually lift the lid on the system, because otherwise it's just opaque. No one understands it. So we try and explain it and for our viewers to basically grasp. So, I mean, this is fascinating what you're saying. And I can see why now you're saying that actually bubbles are intentional, because it then raises questions around this new AI bubble this new AI bubble, which I think is probably a extension of this, right?
Yeah.
But I want to come back to 2008. So
Sure.
So 2008 was obviously seismic. The late Alistair Darling, who was the governor of the Bank of England at the time, just explain what was he trying to do? Who was he trying to save?
Okay. So, as I kind of explained, that because of the subprime mortgages, you basically had extremely risky debt that was being packaged up with more reliable debt. And effectively what ended up happening in the mortgage-backed security market specifically, because people didn't know where the bad debt was located, that particular market seized up. So what that meant was that banks had stopped trading in mortgage-backed securities, and more so than that, banks had stopped trading amongst themselves because they couldn't trust one another. They didn't know who was in trouble, who was sitting on bad debt, and who wasn't.
Hence the credit crunch.
The credit crunch, absolutely. Yeah. So, they knew that some banks were going to experience massive losses. They just didn't know. They didn't know who. So when eventually the event started to unravel, it became apparent that actually it affected a whole host of banks. So, for example, I think Northern Rock was the first bank that was affected in the UK. I think Barclays was affected. RBS was affected. These are banks that all needed to be bailed out by the government in the end.
Yeah.
And that's because the losses were so great that they ate into the capital reserves of these banks. So just to explain briefly how basically a bank balance sheet works. On the balance sheet you have an asset column and you have a liabilities column. The asset column is the debt that is created by the bank, which they make returns on. So that could be mortgage debt, it could be government bonds, it could be corporate debt. Things
you own, basically.
Things you own and things that generate a return. In the liabilities column you have equity, which is basically share ownership, and then you also have deposits. So bank deposits, customer deposits will sit on the liability side. Underpinning all of that is what is referred to as capital reserves, right? So this is like a small reserve of money which effectively allows the bank to leverage up their asset side, and they can create. So, for example, if they have $1 million worth of capital, they can leverage that up by 10 times to $10 million, and therefore they can create $10 million worth of assets. So what's meant to happen is that whenever a loss is experienced on the asset side, it the capital reserves is meant to cover for that loss. Right?
If you don't have enough.
If you don't have enough, then the bank becomes technically insolvent.
And that's what we...
And this is what happened in 2008. The losses were so huge that it basically blew up the capital reserves of all of these major banks. And that's the reason why they needed to be bailed out.
So what you're basically saying is Alistair Darling was trying to save the banks and the financial institutions,
Absolutely.
and not necessarily the common man directly.
Absolutely.
Although to be fair, you could argue that that's how you save the common man is by effectively saving the banks, because they're too big to fail. You can't let them fail.
Yeah. So in 2008, look, ordinarily what would happen is that in an economy, if you've got failing institutions under liberal capitalism, those failing institutions are meant to be left to collapse.
Yeah.
Right. That's, the guiding principle is basically survival of the fittest. The idea is that the strong will survive and the weak will
diminish.
will diminish. That's what's meant to happen.
Yeah.
But what had happened by 2008, it goes back to the point that I was making, that over the course of decades, the global financial system had become so interconnected, and that the real economy had become dependent on the financial system, that by 2008, they couldn't allow the financial system to collapse. They couldn't allow the banks to collapse. Otherwise, the entire economy would go down with it.
But is that how it was meant? So is this a result of policy, or is that how it's meant to be?
It was a result of policy. So it was a direct result, not necessarily government policy, banking rules and regulations.
Right.
So what effectively happened was that you have these multilateral financial institutions like the Bank of International Settlements, which is referred to as the central bank of central banks. Then you have the IMF and you have the World Bank. So these banks, what they do is they serve as the regulatory body of really the entire global financial banking system. And so their job is to design the rules and regulations that commercial banks abide by. So it was specifically these rules and regulations that created the conditions that led to the 2008 collapse, not necessarily the policies that were pursued by independent individual governments and states themselves.
Okay, so we can conclude that they were trying to save the banks rather than the individuals. So this raises, I guess, questions around. I mean, again, just to reference an interview I watched with Jeffrey Epstein again and Steve Bannon. Heard some wild things in this interview. Like, for example, Jeffrey Epstein's explaining how he's in county jail. He's not actually not allowed to make any phone calls, and he's on the phone to the CEO of Bear Stearns and I think Goldman Sachs at the same time.
Yeah.
Right. And we'll try and get this clip up so people could, sounds a bit wild. But this convicted criminal is on the phone to the CEO of two banks, and they're discussing various things, right? How to navigate the crisis. So I guess it raises serious questions around, not only around Epstein, which is a much bigger conversation, but actually what I'm trying to say is Epstein wasn't just an ordinary person. That's why he was so intertwined with everybody and all the politicians and whatever. He was representing the banking system. That's the point. So, you can see there was a massive movement of the banking system trying to protect itself and leveraging against governments. Now, if you're a common person, if you're a common man like us guys, isn't that wholly ironic? Because if you have a business and you don't do very well in that business, you can't go to the bank and say, bail me out. But here we have a system protecting the very people that caused the crisis in the first place.
Absolutely. So I think the way to understand it that there's a power hierarchy and there's a power structure. So when you talk about the banking system, really the banking system is right at the top of the power structure. Some people even argue that actually the financial system sits on top of nation states themselves. And that actually, when you talk about the entities, the institutions, and the people that are manipulating global events, that actually it's these financial institutions and the people that run them.
I think the coin of phrase. One day we'll have to do a podcast on that.
No, for sure, it's a fascinating topic, and it's not something that has just emerged over the course of the last couple of decades. This has been going on for centuries.
Yeah.
So it's not a new thing. So from the perspective of the political elite, I think who was the Secretary of the Treasury during the
Janet
Bush
Yellen?
administration? No, the Bush. It was Hank Paulson.
Oh, Hank Paulson.
So Hank Paulson basically put a gun to George W. Bush's head and said that if you do not bail out the banks, the entire global economy is going to collapse.
On your watch.
On your watch, right? So instead of being given the time to actually just understand the crisis, what's going on, who's to blame, is there another way to resolve it? Effectively what they did, it was a sort of a coup d'etat where they didn't give Bush the time necessary to be able to come up with a solution that would ensure that the public didn't suffer and that the people that are innocent in this whole event didn't pay the price for
checks and balances. So the theory would be, so look, I as I said, I'm not an economic theorist. I do obviously have a background in economics, but I've worked in the system, so I know how the system actually works, not how it's intended to work. And this is why I was saying, well, this is just how the system works. But I guess the problem with the system here is the incentives that created the problem in the first place have never been removed. So if you've got a central banking system and you've got banks that are effectively linked to the central banking system, then in theory, the central bankers control the banks. In theory. So in theory, they direct the capital by saying, we want you to invest in these 10 things. And the banks will then go and facilitate it. That's what should happen. But the reality is, that's not what happens. So if you look at central bankers, you look at Hank Paulson, you look at Ben Bernanke, Federal Reserve, famously known as
Helicopter
Ben, because his solution to everything, he said his solution to the Great Depression of the 1930s was to literally throw money out of a helicopter, because that's what they didn't do. Anyway, that's just a side point. But Ben Bernanke, Hank Paulson, Janet Yellen, to some degree, Alistair Darling, Ed Balls, Mark Carney, who's now the Prime Minister or President of Canada. I can't remember which role he had.
Prime Minister.
Yeah, Prime Minister of Canada. It's a revolving door. This is the problem. So this is what I mean by false incentives. So the bankers, the central bankers, work for the banks, and the banks also work. So it's one very cozy relationship. And so this is why Jeffrey Epstein, this is why I keep bringing him up. I'm not bringing him up because he's obviously discredited, but he's only just discredited now. This guy was a pedophile in a prison, and still the banking system is ringing this guy up for advice because of his connections. And this is the problem. When you have perverse incentives, the whole system fails. So the irony is, to actually go back to the question, Alistair Darling is saving the banking system because of the way the banking system has, as you said, inserted itself to the very fiber of capitalist countries, and they have to be saved.
Absolutely. So really what it's about, it's about maintaining power structures. So the point that you're making is you demonstrating the incestuous relationship that exists between various different aspects of power. So you've got the government, you've got the financial system, you've got the military-industrial complex, you've got big tech now that have joined that structure. And naturally, any such structure, their priority is going to be maintaining their power. And so in 2008, what happened was that one of the key pillars of that system was on the verge of collapse, and they couldn't allow that to happen, which is the reason why the likes of Alistair Darling and I think it was Ben Bernanke, wasn't it? That was the chairman of the
Yeah.
Federal Reserve back then. They had to save it.
Yeah.
Because if the entire financial system collapsed, if the banks collapsed, then the entire system would collapse, including the global economy. So they're going to save their own. That's the point. They won't necessarily act in the public interest, although they'll dress it up as though they are acting in the public interest. But in fact, what they're doing is they're preserving their own power, and they're preserving the power structure that they immensely benefit from.
I would welcome people to watch the Big Short.
Yeah, excellent movie.
Excellent movie, because when you see there's a bit towards the end where they've gone to the credit agencies. Who have offices on Wall Street, by the way. That's the ironic thing. And they've gone to the credit agency saying, do you know that all these debts are, all these CDOs, these tranche debts are basically going to collapse. And Moody's, I think, said, yes, we know. And they said, aren't you going to do anything? And they said, no. And they said, why not? And they said, because our partners are the banks. So the very regulator that's meant to regulate the banks is essentially saying we can't regulate the banks because we're all in it together. So that was really funny. So coming back to the next point, because I think this is where I think we need to look at solutions. So what did Alistair Darling et al. Do? They've created something called quantitative easing. Which sounds like a laxative to me, but
a lot of people think that.
Yeah, it's quantitative easing. Now, quantitative easing is the solution they came out with, and this directly impacts why we are in this situation today, where asset prices have just spiraled out of control and wages have been suppressed. So please bear with us. This is a little bit complicated, but we will try and simplify it. What is quantitative easing, and why did Alistair Darling choose it?
Sure. So quantitative easing is a mechanism that is used to create and inject liquidity into the system. So what happened in 2008, the banks had suffered immense losses. So governments basically took a two-pronged approach. The first was to recapitalize the banks, which was done through taxpayer bailout. So that was the first course of action. And the second one was for central banks to purchase distressed assets, so mortgage-backed securities or CDOs or any
dodgy debt.
Any type of dodgy debt. And what the central banks effectively did, they needed to increase liquidity in the system, which just means that it needed to inject more cash. Right, because that cash is necessary to build up the buffer and the protection layers in the system. So they just simply went around hoovering up dodgy assets and giving cash to the banks, and those banks initially they just sat on it. So what they did, the quantitative easing cash sat in U.S. Federal Reserve accounts as excess reserves, and I think the same was true with the Bank of England. That primarily it was just sitting there generating interest for the banks, and they weren't actually deploying that capital initially. But then later on, as you kind of mentioned, that once confidence returned back to the system and banks were willing to take more risks, they started to invest that cash in more sort of high returning assets, basically.
So I think I wrote a paper on QE, quantitative easing. So I'll just quickly explain it because I think it's quite helpful. So essentially, governments generally in most Western economies are not allowed to create money because it creates a perverse incentive. This is a check and balance in the system. So governments don't create money. They're not allowed to. They would print money all the time if they could. So in order to control that, they have a independent body called the central bank. And in the case of the UK, that's the Bank of England. And the Bank of England can create money, but the government can't. Now, government can issue bonds, which is a debt. It's a government debt. And what they do is they reserve a special type of bond, which is bought by the Bank of England. So the Bank of England creates money from nothing. It literally just creates the money. There's no gold backing, there's no petrol, there's no oil backing, no assets. It just creates the money and it buys the government's bonds immediately off the government. And you say, so why do they do that? One, because they're not allowed to create money, but two, also because what people don't realize is bonds, all other instruments, debt instruments and credit instruments, which are things, a product you can buy, are indexed to the bond price. So for instance, if you were to buy a high return asset, it might say something like 2% above the bond rate. So whatever the bond rate is 2% above the bond rate. And so the bond rate is effectively, it's setting the tone. And that comes from the government. So when the government effectively makes those bonds available, the Bank of England buys them. So one part of the government, one part of the, I guess, establishment buys from the other part. That's pretty much how that works. And it can only go, so therefore it can only go to the Bank of England, who then makes it available to its banks like Barclays, NatWest, HSBC, etc. So that then essentially sits on with them. And anybody close, the closer you are to the financial system, the more access you have to this money. This is not for the common man. Now, that quantitative easing sits with the banks, and what do? Well, they have to shore up their position. So they start buying assets. So they'll start buying property. They'll start buying gold. They'll start buying any asset that has an intrinsic value. They might even buy bonds they might even buy the currencies of, China or Russia and any other currency. So that's why people suddenly realize that despite having a financial crash, despite being in a recession, the price of property suddenly shoots up. And this is why people can never explain. I don't understand why. No one's earning any money, but why are the prices going up? Well, the prices are going up because through quantitative easing, these banks and financial institutions are literally hoovering up these assets. Yeah. And because they're competing with each other, the price goes up. So that's the first problem. So what this does is this creates a massive asset hike. And what that means is the common man, let's say he's 2008, 2009, out of work, or even if you're in work, you're told your wages are frozen, but the price of all of these assets go up. The other things that they start doing is they'll start buying commodities like wheat, barley, etc., gold, silver. So all of those go up, and when they go up, they are inputs into final products. So things you buy, things you eat, whatever, the prices of those go up. So suddenly, what you find is not only are your property prices up, which means your rents are up, it also means that the things you buy, the breads, the food, the takeaway, all the common things, they also go up. And this is how quantitative easing creates this problem.
Yeah, absolutely correct. I mean, I liken it to oil, actually. So, obviously we've kind of been discussing the impact of the Iran conflict on the global economy and inflation. So the reason why energy impacts the prices of everything is because energy permeates through every layer of the economy, right? From, the production of food to basically transportation, all of these things. And credit works in exactly the same way if you think about it. In the same way that energy permeates through every layer of the economy, so does credit. Right? Without credit, this economy cannot run. And this is why I made the point that over the course of the last sort of 50 years or so, what these banks have done, they have just flooded the global economy with credit, which means that eventually, remember, for pretty much the entirety of the last decade, the base interest rate was close to zero. Just small incremental increases in the interest rate is going to raise the cost of debt servicing and therefore the cost of goods and services, because as you rightly point out, the increase in the cost of financial servicing has to be passed onto the consumer in the form of higher prices. So it's a form of cost push inflation is what ends up resulting. And it goes back to the point that I made, that the reason why this is happening now is because the financial system, banks have become indispensable to the global economy. when that was never the case historically. You go back 100, 200, 300 years, you may have an incident where a bank is in trouble, right? But that bank the collapse of that bank wouldn't have a material impact on the overall banking system. Now, if one or two banks go under, then the whole system goes under. And that's a consequence of the interdependence of the banking system.
Very, very sobering. So after the 2008 crash, we then had COVID, and we've now had this Ukraine war. So what's been the impact of that on this already difficult situation?
So COVID is, if you think about it, it's not too dissimilar to what's going on at the moment. So I think the pandemic was formally announced early part of 2020. And then for whatever reason, Western governments decided to shut down their economies for the best part of two years, right? So if you think about that for a moment, that the way that the global economy is structured is that Western economies tend to be consumption based, whilst Eastern economies tend to be production based, right? So what happens is that the economies in the East will consume the natural resources, they'll convert them into consumer goods, and those consumer goods will be exported to the West. So the result of Western economies deciding to shut down their economies had an impact on the producing economies, because demand ultimately collapsed, right? And that obviously had an impact on the economies that had productive economies. So in that scenario, how was the West able to ensure that their economies didn't collapse? It was through quantitative easing. That was a solution that they
Is there no other solution? Why do they constantly just flood?
Okay, so the reason why they opted for quantitative easing during the pandemic is because debt levels are debt still needs to be serviced, right? But if you shut down the economy, then people can't earn the income to service the debt.
So you mean government can't service the debt? Is that
Governments can't service the debt. Households can't service the debt. Businesses can't service the debt because they're not generating income. So in this scenario, the central banks had to step in and they had to provide liquidity into the system so that these entities could continue to operate and service their debt.
I'd like to probe this a bit more, right? So you said they can't service the debt. So I think this is what is meant by financialization. So this is the flooding of debt onto everything. So so you're saying personal debt, government debt, all of this is created debt, right? So it has to be serviced. Why are non-financialized countries not at risk? Aren't they? I mean, wouldn't they have the same problem?
They're not as financialized to the same degrees as Western economies. So the interesting thing is, I think it was Imran Khan that was Prime Minister of Pakistan during the pandemic, and he basically made the point that we don't have the luxury of shutting down our economies for 2 years, right? Because in reality, what happens is if you stop economic activity, then how are people going to feed themselves, clothe themselves, or ensure that they have access to the bare essentials? So this is a part of the privilege that Western economies have, that they can shut down their economies for 2 years
because
they can print money,
right,
and still export essentials from other parts of the world and not feel the pinch, right? Whereas the rest of the world, they don't have that luxury. They have to continue producing. The other insightful thing is, of the whole sort of coronavirus pandemic episode, is it kind of demonstrated that do Western economies actually produce anything of value? Because if you have the luxury of being able to shut down your economy for 2 years, what do you actually do? What do you produce that brings any value?
So here's some numbers that I dug up. UK debt in 2007 was about 500 billion pounds. UK debt after COVID has gone up to 2 trillion pounds. And by the way, these are government figures, not mine, not my own. The quantitative easing stock after COVID, so that doesn't include Ukraine, by the way, it's just COVID, is something like 895 billion, which is the total asset purchases by the Bank of England, basically. So effectively, debt has quadrupled since 2007. So while you said, okay, to quote Imran Khan, they don't have the luxury, but actually the price of it is what you're seeing today. So this is the point about why is the outlook poorer? Because fundamentally, all this money tree debt, all this debt which is coming from this money tree, has to be serviced. And who's it being serviced by? It's being serviced by people, and it's been serviced by the taxpayer, and it's been serviced by governments who have been borrowing this money, because it has to end up somewhere. And this probably explains why HMRC have been extremely harsh and ruthless with people. This constant debate I see on LinkedIn about taxis, HMRC, coming after every type of activity. This now makes sense, because you have to collect all this money to pay off the debt. Yeah. And I don't actually know how much. I mean, what is the debt servicing numbers for the UK at the moment? Do you know?
Specifically, I couldn't put a number on it right now. Sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. We can look that up. So this explains suddenly this massive disparity, because all this debt needs to be paid off.
Yeah.
And that's why wages have been depressed at the same time as obviously this massive asset inflation.
Yeah, exactly. So the QE, right? What were they printing the money for, right? It was for furlough. So what they were doing is they were paying people to basically sit at home and what's the term? Netflix and chill.
Yeah.
Right. 80% of people's salary was still being paid, even though they weren't working. And it was the government that was printing the money so that companies could, effectively.
To be honest, working with the public sector, I think they're still doing Netflix and chill. But anyway, so that's a different conversation entirely, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so this now explains how we've got into this mess. So I think it's worth explaining something. Actually, just looking into this, thinking about this actually, is you can see when you effectively print money and you service the debt with interest, asset prices shoot up, because the people that are lending have the money, because they're taking the money off the people who are borrowing. And because it's fixed returns, those returns at no risk, those returns are coming in all the time. And so they would buy more assets. The people who are doing the borrowing will then go and buy more assets.
That's right.
And the poorer will have less assets, so that it becomes a circuit amongst the wealthy.
Yeah, so that's part of it. The other issue really is that if you establish an economy which is primarily based on rent-seeking behavior, which is what you're describing, right? So the reason that investors want to put their money into assets is because they can collect rents off them. So what happens is that the GDP that is generated by a country, the vast majority of that income just goes on, rent-seeking behavior, right? So it's just people that own assets, whether they be debt or whether they be, physical assets like property, are just forever collecting rent. And that means that that's money that is not being used in a productive way, right? So that's money that could be used to increase the productive capacity of the economy, right? Increase the number of goods and services that are being produced, which will bring down the price of goods and services. So this is fundamentally the problem with the model that has been adopted by Western liberal economies, where everything, whether it's the stock market, whether it's property, whether it's the bond market, everything is just simply about capital and maximizing the return on capital, instead of actually taking a chance, investing it in ways which is going to really increase the productive capacity of a society, increase the economic output, which ultimately benefits everybody.
is it fair to conclude from your point that, look, unless there's a shift in financialization, which is the dependence on debt created by banks, unless you deal with that, you're not going to see a change in the gap between assets like properties and wages. So that will only grow.
Yeah.
That's the outlook. And energy, there needs to be an independent energy strategy, at least in Europe, somewhere, somehow. So this war in Ukraine makes no sense. They really need to think about doing that. Otherwise, it looks like the outlook is quite bleak. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying.
So it's not recoverable, basically.
Yeah, unless major reforms, major changes occur, then eventually what's going to happen, that the trajectory is just going to continue until eventually you have an implosion of the system, and that's certainly what we're heading for. And what the political elite are trying to do, they can see that the writing's on the wall, and they are trying to come up with the excuses for why this is happening. And so I think it's important that people realize that they are being gaslit, that they are being misled by their political elite, and take action, because only they can really take the necessary action to work in their own interest, because quite clearly the political elite are not.
Thank you for a really thought-provoking discussion. I'd like to conclude there by saying I hope our viewers can see that there is a constant misdirection of the system to players and actors that are not necessarily to blame, because some of the real reasons and I guess some of the real motivations are caused by other people. And this is something that I think is important as we go through our podcast. We will actually break this down in more detail. And go into the players, their motivations, and actually who they serve.